Ladies and gentlemen, great pleasure to welcome you here to our first session, which is on community and civic engagement, about the context and the big picture. We have a kind of a combination. You are particularly invited to contribute, to think with us, and to think particularly inspired by the speakers. So we organize it in the following way. We have 4 speakers. They all are going to keep themselves to the 20 minutes. Going to be difficult, but they are going to keep themselves to the 20 minutes of presentation. So they speak one after the other. And please, if you have something which you think of while they speak as a comment, do take out your notepad and make some notes, because they speak after the other, and then it's your turn. We expect you very much to be engaged in an active discussion. So, in terms of introducing the speakers, I'm not going to read the bios. The bios are in the booklet which you got from the meeting, but I just give a very brief introduction to the first speaker. That's غلام Mohammed Bey. He is a civil engineer. You will hear many scientists speak about community involvement. Has been a development banker at some point in time, but is particularly well known for his role as former Secretary General of the African Association of Universities. And he speaks about the social responsibility of universities as an overview. غلام, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joe. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let me first thank the Ministry of Higher Education for inviting me to the conference and to give me an opportunity to talk about a topic which I think is so important nowadays, the social responsibility of universities. We talk about teaching, we talk about research and so on, and we talk about community engagement as well. That is important. But to look at social responsibility from a global point of view, from an overall point of view, I think is very important. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'll give you an overview, and I think this will, I hope, the speakers that will follow afterwards, not just in this session, but in the sessions that will follow as well, can slot in with experiences from their own institutions and so on. A quick outline of what I'm going to talk about. First of all, try and understand what do we mean by social responsibility of universities? Why is it important? And then look at how a social responsibility can be embedded in the various functions of the university, teaching and learning. And I've included cross-border higher education provision as a separate part of teaching and learning, but it is, of course, very much part of teaching and learning. Research, community engagement, and institutional management. And then I'll end up with a few words of conclusion. What do we mean by social responsibility of universities? Social responsibility is often confused with community service or community engagement, which is, of course, part of social responsibility. And that is the community engagement is the third function of the universities. But my contention is that social responsibility is a far broader and deeper context, not just community engagement. It goes well beyond that. Excuse me. Trying to find a definition is not easy, and from some of the articles and papers that I have read, this is something that I found probably would be more appropriate. A university's responsibility to preach and practice a set of principles and values through its core functions of teaching, research, community engagement, and institutional management. Of course, this definition has no sense unless you go and spell out what about this set of principles and values? What are the values that you're looking at? Then the definition has more meaning. So let's look at those principles and values. These include commitment to fairness, truth, and ethics, promotion of social equity and sustainable human development, recognition of an individual's dignity and liberty, appreciation of diversity and multiculturalism, promotion of human rights, democracy, and civic responsibility. That's not a very entirely comprehensive list. I'm sure you could add on to it, but it gives you a flavor of the point that I'm trying to make, that there are certain core values that must be, be embedded in so many parts of the university that really is the whole purpose of social responsibility of universities. And the point I make again there is that social responsibility is not a separate activity like community engagement or community service or teaching or whatever. It should in fact be the very essence of the university, its ethos, the way it is, the way it operates. It's only when you embed all this in everything that the university does that I believe the mission of the university achieving social responsibility can be achieved. Why is social responsibility of universities important in this day and age? Why is this topic come up? Why is this conference organized around that particular theme? Various reasons, and I'll go through some of them. The first thing is that increasingly one is regarding higher education as a private good, where I believe it isn't. It is a public good, just like health is a public good. Even if people argue that you have private universities and it's private funded, I believe it doesn't matter. Even if the public doesn't entirely fund higher education sector, it has a responsibility towards it because it is a public good. And it has a responsibility for planning it, for organizing it, for ensuring that everything is going well. Another point is that we have now trade liberalization through World Trade Organization and GATS. And higher education is also being regarded as a commodity, something that you can trade, just like you trade goods and services. And when you start doing that, then ethics and principles and values start to diminish. We know that public universities are undergoing a funding crisis all over the world, whether it's developing or developed, and that universities are increasingly being run as corporate entities, the main objective being generate income, make money so that you can cover your costs. And sometimes in doing that, you throw overboard quality and even ethics at times. We now have large number of private universities, and many of them are doing excellent work, it is well known, but many of them are also purely for profit, completely business oriented, and these numbers are on the increase, and you find them increasingly in, for example, developing countries. A point that is also important when you talk of social responsibility of universities is cross-border higher education. Cross-border higher education, when a particular higher education is provided in another country, it crosses borders, it goes from one country to the other. It's very widespread now. I think there's hardly any country where you don't find cross-border higher education, and not all the providers really act fairly or ethically. Another important point is that universities, excuse me for saying so, but a bit like governments, adopt usually a short-term market-driven approach. They look at short-term, the next 4 years, the next 5 years, what is it that we can make our universities function. Whereas they have a responsibility, I believe, to look at long-term. They need to look at the long-term vision of their country, of what's going to happen, and what are the challenges that we're going to meet in the future. And I think that is very much the responsibility of universities. With improved technology, we know that there is fraud and deception in higher education. It's on the increase. You have diploma mills. I don't know whether you've received emails before. I have, when people are selling me diplomas online. And it's so genuine that all they ask me is that you mention the university you want to have a certificate from. Not any cheap university. It could even be Oxford and Cambridge or whatever. Mention the year and we'll do the rest. All you have to do is pay us $300. That's what the sort of game that is being played in higher education these days. You have false accreditation bodies who supposedly accredit universities, and yet they're false, and so on. So this fraud and deception is really coming into higher education, and I think we have to watch out for that. Major advances are taking place in research, and many of them raise ethical issues that could have long-term, serious social impact. Cloning, for example, is one of them. There are major disparities in human and social development between countries and regions that affect global sustainable development, and these need to be addressed by universities. I don't know how many of you read the University World News, but the latest issue that came out yesterday, if you read an article there, it's an interview given by the Vice Chancellor of Cambridge University when he was in Australia. And he made a very strong statement that what are considered to be the best and the best endowed universities in this world have a responsibility to look after the poor, the 1.3 billion or whatever poverty that the world is facing. And they could do so by collaborating with universities that exist in these particular countries. I think this is an enormous message that's coming from one of the best universities in the world, perhaps. Cambridge is usually ranked among the top 2 or 3 in the world ranking, even if I don't believe entirely in the world ranking. Still, I think the message is there that universities, irrespective of where they are, irrespective of the country they are in, they have a responsibility to look at the world in a global sense, to look at their country, of course, but look at the world in a global sense and remove disparities among communities and among countries. Universities also need to address global challenges. It follows from my previous argument. There are global challenges taking place: climate change, poverty, water, food, and so on. And this affects not a particular region, they affect the whole world. And this is an opportunity for universities to get together, to pool their resources and to try and solve some of these problems. Universities also have a responsibility to promote world peace, and they must instill in students an understanding and appreciation for diverse cultures, a desire to assist the less fortunate, and to make the world a better place to live in. I don't think any other institution can do that. Any other institution which have large population of young people between the age of 18 to 22, 23, ripe at the right time to instill these values into the students. And I think the world can be a much better place if they manage to do that. Let's now go and look at specifically the activities of the university and how social responsibility can be embedded in them. The first one is to ensure equity of access and success for minority groups. They should not be ignored. Attempts should be made to reach out to them, and the physically challenged and the underprivileged as well. That's a responsibility universities have. The course provision should not be governed solely by market-driven demand, and I've mentioned this. You should not just look at short term, look at long term, what's going to happen in the future. And many of the programs that universities decide not to run, in the short term, it's okay, they will make the money and they will get, they will close the department or whatever. But long-term consequences could be very serious. Another way to promote social responsibility is to have, to try and adopt a multidisciplinary approach, interlinking natural and applied and social sciences. This is because many of the problems that the world faces doesn't fall in one particular field. It crosses a number of fields. And by doing that, it would help universities to solve many of these problems. And also introduce the concept of ethics and social responsibility among the students. In everything that is being taught in the class, I think the lecturer, the professor can, in some ways, pass on the message of the importance of ethics and social responsibility. And create an awareness of global sustainable development and the challenges that we are facing. And encourage the students, as I said, to think not just locally, but to think globally, even if the main action is local. And to promote multicultural understanding and embed an international dimension in the curricula. Encourage student exchanges. That's an enormous potential. There's enormous potential there. And it is taking place. I know it's taking place in many countries, but it is really a very, very powerful way of student exchange is a very powerful way of embedding international dimension in the curricula, in making students understand the diverse cultures that exist, in appreciating them, and in removing any thoughts that they may have about other communities and so on. Because after all, people are the same. They may differ in in race, in religion, in color, or whatever it is, but all of them are more or less the same. They have the same values, the same principle, the same ambitions. And by traveling from one region to another, which is completely different culturally, I think students tend to appreciate and understand these issues. I've picked out cross-border higher education provision as a separate part of teaching and learning because I think their social responsibility makes a very important part. It plays a very important role. At the moment, most of the cross-border higher education takes place from north to south, where the demand in the south, the demand for higher education is the greatest at the moment. And because of the funding crisis, cross-border higher education is becoming an important means of universities to raise funds for their own home institutions. And that leads to a number of issues by knowing that there's a problem and you need to make provision. I think these cross-border providers should ensure that they do not lure students with false and deceptive propaganda and adverts. I've seen an advert of a university functioning in another country and saying, I've got a lovely campus in such and such country, and it shows a beautiful building. In effect, the campus is only part of a floor of that building. It's just a different concept and passing the message, this is my university in such and such country. It is false, and I think that's wrong. The tuition fees that they charge, many of them are for profit. The tuition fees that they charge should be reasonable, and they should not really make students take too many fees. And wherever they operate, because they're operating in a different environment, they should take into account the local values, the local cultures, and the local priorities as well. And also make sure that in their provision, there's always quality. That often also is a problem. And they must ensure that they do not weaken the existing local public universities, which very often they do. For example, by luring academics from those public universities, by offering them better salaries. They can offer better salaries because they function in a different way, they're private institutions, or by using these faculty extensively for part-time lecturing, again weakening the local institutions. And where there is distance education provision, open and distance learning, very often they don't provide adequate support services to the students. And that as well is their responsibility, they should do that. Research. We know, and we talked about it yesterday in a very interesting workshop that we had, that global ranking uses heavily research as the criteria. And this can lead to closing of some departments with low research output. It is happening in many universities. Geography is not very, it doesn't attract many students. If they find it difficult to find jobs, what's the point? It can't do much research in geography, close the department. But what's the long-term consequences of that? If a country doesn't, teach geography and make people understand what the country is about and give the historical part of it and so on, history is another one, then what is the future? Where will the next generation, how will they learn about geography and history and so on? The recruitment of highly skilled researchers to improve ranking can have a very negative impact on developing countries because some universities target the best brains wherever they are. It doesn't matter where they are. And if they happen to be in developing countries, it doesn't matter. Lure them, pay them well, bring them over so that the ranking can increase because they will be more research productive. Even countries have even changed their immigration laws. When some students go and do PhD, they are allowed now to stay on simply because to give them an opportunity to continue to work in that particular country. And we don't realize that in fact they would be more useful to their own country if they return back to their own country and serve there, rather than serving in the countries where they went to do the PhD. And inevitably you get brain drain. Some advanced research, medicine, genetics, and so on, do raise...
1 more minute, please.
How many? 1 minute? Okay, let me go quickly. They raise major ethical and moral issues, could have important social impact, and cloning is one of them. Funding of research by private sector could aim at promoting their own products, for example, in pharmaceuticals, food, and so on. And there is a sense of drive for fame and recognition, which leads to tampering of research results. I did mention this earlier on. And plagiarism in research papers and even in PhD theses is very common. We have cases of parliamentarians who have falsified their PhD theses. Community engagement, you'll hear more about it, so I'll go fairly quickly. It's an important pillar of higher education, we know, but very often not significant attention is given to it. Students do form an enormous pool of valuable resources for assisting communities served by the university, and through community engagement, students can really deal with social, political, and cultural issues. And this promotes a sense of civic responsibility in students and lead to socially responsible citizens. And universities in developed countries are ideally placed to undertake international community service in developing countries to promote multicultural understanding. You'll hear about it later on in the other sessions when, for example, the Talwa network makes a presentation. That's the last point I was going to make, and you'll hear about Talwa a little bit later on. Institutional management as well. Universities should instill a sense of social responsibility in students by promoting sustainable development principles on campus, introduce energy-saving measures, encourage reduction in newspaper, recycle waste, greening the campus, generally speaking. And also in management to practice consultative, fair, transparent, and accountable management, and to ensure that students participate fully in all the other processes. Later on, you will hear from specific universities how they achieve this in their own campuses. Let me conclude. My 1 minute is almost over. Because universities train future leaders and decision makers, it is important for them to ensure that their students become socially responsible citizens. And universities must resist this wave of commercialization and commodification that is being brought about by globalization. Responding to short-term market demands must not be their sole mission. They have a responsibility, a social responsibility, to cater for long-time societal needs. Universities also have a responsibility to assist those who are less fortunate, whether in their own country or in other parts of the world. And universities must address some of the major global challenges in order to achieve global sustainable development. Universities have multiple objectives. They should not aim at simply excelling in research just to be globally competitive. They must use social responsibility. All universities must use social responsibility as a major guiding principle in all their activities, in whatever they do. Thank you.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, غلام. I think this was really very inspiring. It also, I thought, contained quite a bit of a challenge, because what you say, I think, is something which goes very much to the heart of many of us, but at the same time, why is social responsibility and the way in which universities carry this out not part of rankings? If it would be something accepted, then it would be also in the rankings, I would assume. But so these are questions, but once again, we do not have now the time for questions, but later on. So please don't forget to write it down or keep it in your mind, because now we go to the next speaker, which is Ian, and he is the Vice Chancellor of one of the most reputed universities in Asia, but also in the world, which is the Australian National University. He's also a scientist. He is a mathematician, meteorologist originally, but has also an ample experience in university administration. And he, in a way, continues the debate which was started by غلام and actually also this morning by Professor O from the Seoul National University, in a sense, research universities and how do they deal with social responsibility. So the title is Building Community Engagement in a Research-Intensive University. The floor is yours, Ian.
Well, thank you, and can I join with my colleague in thanking the organisers and sponsors for setting up this, what I think is a very interesting conference. The challenge in many cases for research-intensive universities is exactly that. They tend to be single-mindedly focused on research. Yes, teaching's also important, and in many cases community engagement becomes sort of a third leg there, but largely it's forgotten by both staff and indeed the institution as a whole. So how in an institution which has research so core to its mission and goals can you actually make community engagement something which is real? So my university, ANU, is indeed that. It's a research-intensive university. Research and indeed education are embedded in all of the things that we do. So if I just look across the institution, we regularly measure our publication outputs, our research citations, We fixate on our global rankings much too often and much too frequently. We have governments that take us through research assessment exercises on a regular basis. In terms of teaching, we now have regular student evaluations of the quality of teaching as they perceive it. And indeed, we often have national teaching awards and we measure our performance against all those things. So we tend to be very much metrics-driven organisations today, and most of those metrics tend to be around things that are easy to measure, namely research, firstly, and then secondly, education. Of course, these tend to then inculcate themselves into the institution themselves, so tenure, promotion, the things that we actually measure are the things that we tend to reward our staff with. So for community engagement to be taken seriously in that sort of an environment, it has to actually operate at exactly those sorts of levels. It has to be something which is seen by the institution and indeed by the staff of the institution to be as important as research or as important as education within the institution. So if to do that, if you're measuring everything else, you must have real measurable goals for what you're going to do around community engagement, and they must be embedded within the institution itself. So let me set myself in my own context then at the Australian National University. Our name says what we are. We're a national university and we want to be Australia's national institution. And we do that in competition with a whole host of other quality universities in Australia. So to be truly the national university, we want to firstly be excellent in terms of research, because that's what most people measure and remember you by, and ANU regularly ranks in the top 50 institutions in the world. It's produced 5 Nobel Prize winners and consistently performs at that sort of level. We also want to be national in terms of our student population. So in the case of ANU, 65% of our students come from somewhere outside of the city that we're actually located in. They might be either international or indeed domestic students, but domestic students from other locations. So we're national geographically as well. We also want to be seen nationally and indeed internationally as a leader in terms of education and research, to be innovative in the things that we do. And finally, and this is what I'm going to come back to, we also see that as a national institution we've got a very important role in actually shaping public policy. So we want to be an institution that does more than produces great research. We want to be able to use that intellectual capacity we have to be able to shape the nation, hopefully for the better. And so within the university, when we actually started to look at, well, how would we really make community engagement real, the first thing for us was to say, well, what's our community? So if you're a national university, we said our community is in fact the nation. So how could we actually engage with that whole nation? And the way that we felt we could do this was really around this theme of public policy. So if we could in fact shape the nation through the intellectual capacity of the institution, then we would have actually made an enormous contribution to the nation and indeed to our community. And so we've tried to really shape our community engagement around this notion of public policy and the way that we would actually contribute to public policy. So I need to say a little bit about what public policy is. Well, public policy is really, I think, the way in which not only universities but a whole host of organisations, and indeed in many cases our civil service or public service, actually takes knowledge and uses it to shape the future of the nation. So if I look at my own university, I can find public policy scattered across almost every faculty within the institution. So I can find economists who are obviously looking at the national budget, or people in health who are interested in epidemics and public health and epidemiology and these sorts of things. I can obviously find politicians or political scientists interested in the politics of the country. People within my engineering area, for instance, who may be interested in new and different forms of energy, but also vitally interested in the public policy dimension of that, of how you would actually shape public opinion, for instance, to reduce energy or to adopt new energy measures. We look at the environment and the critical issues around global climate change. In a country like Australia, Indigenous affairs is something which is critically important to a whole host of our public policy issues. And of course, for any nation, your foreign affairs is something which is also critically important. So by the nature of public policy, it's something which actually spans the entire institution, and ANU is not unique in that sense. And that is both a challenge, but it's also a great strength as well. By having public policy scattered across the institution, I've got something which I can use to actually engage my academic staff from right across the university. But it also has the disadvantage that from an institution, if somebody's looking from outside in and they want to be able to identify our strengths in public policy, there's no clear front door for them to be able to do that. So our approach has been to try and address these issues in a number of different ways. So the first thing we wanted to do was to actually create that front door. So we actually set up a School of Public Policy, but as I'll come to you to explain in a moment, that school is really just a vehicle to actually enter the institution. It's not where we concentrate all the public policy in the institution. So we've called that, in our case, the Crawford School of Public Policy, named after, in Australia, a very famous public policy person, somebody who was very influential in the formation of Australia after the Second World War. And so although we have a single school, its role is, yes, to carry out public policy itself, but to be very much an umbrella to bring together public policy from right across the institution. So if I actually, on any day, and you probably won't be able to see this, the print's far too small, but if any day, if I go, for instance, to the Crawford School of Public Policy's website, you'll see a number of really important issues. On there, you'll actually see it advertising public policy events that might be happening, so on any particular day. So here, things happening in nuclear non-proliferation, studies of in this particular case, the politics of Nepal. In the bottom left-hand corner there, you see a whole lot of community engagement activities to actually bring people into the institution to actually see some of the public policy which is happening. Or in the bottom right-hand corner, advertising the many bits of media where our academics are actually out there in the media on any particular day, contributing and participating in that public policy debate. Or, of course, we are a university, so public policy is critically important, and of course the teaching and research of public policy must become important as well. And so you see the school advertising our education programs and indeed our research programs in public policy. And of course, for much of our youth today, the mode of communication is through social media, and so we have a significant social media presence in the public policy space as well. Now, it's fine to have a single school of public policy and you can build much of your reputation around that, but internally within the institution I need to have a mechanism to engage the resources of public policy right across the university. And so within that School of Public Policy we set up an Institute of Public Policy, which is an umbrella which actually spans all of the other faculties of the institution where public policy is involved. And just as we have lecturers and senior lecturers and professors and all sorts of other ranks within the institution, we created a new rank of, in our case, Public Policy Fellows as a way to recognise people across the institution who are contributing actively to public policy. And by actually branding them as this and having them associated with our Institute of Public Policy, we were able to increase the recognition of public policy right across the institution, and to have academic staff embrace with this as something which had academic credibility and prestige within the institution. But we wanted to take this outside the university because it has to really engage with the community, as I said. And so for us, we also wanted to invite people outside of the university to become public policy fellows as well. And we did this particularly within the public service. So public servants who had contributed a good part of their careers to being active in the debate of public policy and indeed in the profession of public policy, who also became public policy fellows within the university. And of course, this is a very good way for us to actually engage the university with our professional public service as well. And so we now have public policy fellows that span many, many disciplines, and I could choose many more than this, but these are some of our fellows in areas as diverse as the environment, economics, government relations, health, international economics. I could go on with energy and a whole range of others as well. We also needed to have a significant figurehead to be able to drive this engagement, and so we appointed a very well-known former public servant, in our case Dr. Ken Henry, who had been Secretary of the Treasury until his recent retirement. He was an excellent appointment to this because he had credibility both within academia and indeed within the public sphere as well. And so we hold numerous events to actually bring the community, and in many cases the community are politicians or public servants or just people from across the nation onto our campus for public lectures, to carry out courses, or indeed for social events which actually can bring everyone together. We very importantly embedded this community engagement in the name of public policy within our strategic plan. So our strategic plan is reasonably long-term, as our speaker said before. In our case, it goes out to the year 2020, and within that strategic plan, there are really three legs to the university: research and education, two obvious ones, and the third one where we see ourselves as a public policy resource for the nation. So that's the way in which we're going to engage with the nation. Within that strategic plan, we have a whole host of key performance indicators to measure our performance around public policy. We importantly don't see this as something which is a rival to research and education, because occasionally my staff would say to me, well, you want us to be outstanding researchers, and that of course takes time, but you also want us to engage in the public debate. And my answer to that is, yes, I do. I expect both of those things. And indeed, to engage in the public debate at the right level, a precursor to that is to be an outstanding researcher. That's why people want to actually hear your opinion. So I don't see these things being in any conflict at all. They reinforce each other very strongly. And indeed, you need to, as an institution, to embed this into the reward structure of the institution. And largely in a university, that's through your promotion system. So public policy becomes a core element of our promotion system as well. So in conclusion, for ANU, as I said, our community engagement has been built around this notion of contributing to public policy. I think you could use the same sort of approach that we have here to other different ways of actually positioning community engagement for different sorts of institutions. My view, however, is that if it's going to have real traction within the university, then it has to have all the attributes of the other things that you value within the university. So it needs to be treated and measured and rewarded in the same ways that institutions reward research and teaching, or it's never taken at the same level as those things within the institution. That also means that it needs to be a key element of your long-term strategic planning. So it needs to be part of your strategic plan, just as you would go out and recruit outstanding staff to be researchers and teachers, you would go out and appoint outstanding staff because of the role that they would play in community engagement, or indeed in this case in our public policy. And as I said, it's important that this is not simply an adjunct, an addition to what you do. It's important that it's actually also embedded in the quality measures of what you do. That is, to contribute to be able to perform at that level in our case in the public policy debate. You must firstly and foremost be an outstanding researcher and indeed an outstanding communicator as well. And I think so, particularly I think within research-intensive universities, which tend to be focused very much on the metrics of research and how they drive rankings and positioning and those sorts of things, unless you actually consider your community engagement in the same sorts of ways, it will always be the poor cousin. And I think we are on a journey to do exactly that. I think the early signs of this are actually very positive in terms of the engagement of our community, both within the university and more broadly across the nation. And as I said, although we have a particular type of community engagement shaped to our particular type of university, I think similar sorts of approaches are also applicable across a wide range of universities. Thank you very much.
I would say thank you so much, Ian Young, for this presentation, which adds also, I think, to the plate. You very much focus on a special dimension of social responsibility, and I guess there will be also questions about the way in which this might permeate through other faculties than in this area of public policy. And so in that respect, I'm sure we will have more questions, but once again, you have to wait with your questions. If you are afraid to forget them, write them down. And so then we go to the next speaker, which is Salim Badat. And he's the Vice Chancellor of Rhodes University of South Africa, one of the most reputed universities also of Africa. He's a change from the two previous speakers in the sense that he comes from the humanities, from the social sciences. Also, he's a bit different, although not as much, from غلام, in the sense that we met some years before when he was working with the ministry. So he has this background both in academia as well as in policy making, active policy making. So he's going to speak about 10 theses on community engagement and universities. I'm very much looking forward to your presentation.
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate and speak at this conference. I'm going to speak about community engagement at two levels, the theoretical conceptual level, but also at the practical organizational logistical level, if you like. If we're going to embrace community engagement at our universities, we have to critically engage with a number of issues. These issues include, firstly, and you'll see why, the very idea of the university itself. What are the core purposes of the university? What are its responsibilities and functions? We really can't approach community engagement without having a conception of why a university exists. We also then, secondly, and often this is not understood well, we have to start to engage with the notion of knowledge. Whose knowledge? Where knowledge comes from? Who constructs knowledge? And as part of this process, I want to argue that you have to also debunk certain myths, like knowledge only comes from Western Europe or North America. Thirdly, we have to be clear about the rationale for undertaking community engagement. Fourthly, what is the value basis of community engagement? It's not possible, in my own view, to undertake community engagement without addressing the issues of values. Fifthly, what do we understand by engagement? And lastly, who is the community? How do we define this thing called community in community engagement? And so in my 20 minutes, I want to address four issues. Firstly, how are we going to conceptualize community engagement? If we don't have a conception of community engagement, if you don't theorize community engagement, I'm afraid it's not likely that you're going to be able to practice community engagement effectively. And what are the different approaches, what are the different implications to community engagement depending on our concepts or theories? Secondly, I want to address in passing, none of us, I think, will disagree that learning and teaching and research are the two core purposes of universities. Do we want to add community engagement to become the third core purpose? Or rather, do we want to reserve for community engagement just one of the roles of a university rather than the status of a core purpose? And you'll see why that becomes an important issue. Thirdly, if there's a relationship, and we know there's a relationship between learning and teaching and research, what is the relationship between community engagement and learning and teaching? What is the relationship between community engagement and research? Is there any? And lastly, if we want to effectively undertake community engagement, if we want to institutionalize community engagement within the universities, what are the necessary conditions before we can do something like that? And what are the implications of institutionalizing community engagement in the different areas of our university? What does it mean for teaching and learning, for research, for institutional governance and management, and so on? And so I want to address this through 10 theses. Firstly, if we're going to interrogate critically the concept of community engagement, rather than just assume it's a good thing and who can resist it, then I think we have to clarify what universities do. And I've already said, in my view, the first purpose of a university is to produce knowledge to advance our understanding of our natural and our social worlds. And of course, also on that basis, to intervene in the world to make it a better place. And the second purpose is to disseminate knowledge and form and cultivate inquiring and critical minds. Those are the two fundamental purposes of universities. And alongside those two fundamental roles, I want to argue there are 5 two purposes. There are 5 roles. Firstly, it's about producing knowledgeable, competent, skilled graduates. Secondly, it's undertaking different kinds of scholarship, discovery, integration, application, teaching. Thirdly, it's contributing to forging a critical and democratic citizenship. Fourthly, it's actively engaging with the pressing economic and social development needs and challenges of our society. And fifthly, it's proactively engaging with our societies at the intellectual and at the general cultural level, not reactively, but proactively. Now, that's a traditional conception of what a university is in terms of its purposes and what it does. Where does community engagement fit into this? My second thesis is we must make a clear distinction between the social and economic responsiveness of a university to its political, economic, and social context, and community engagement. Community engagement, in my view, is different from simply being socially responsive as a university. And so, while being alive to our historical and contemporary conditions and our challenges and so on, being socially responsive does not necessarily mean that a university is engaged in community engagement. Being sensitive to economic and social issues and challenges is a necessary condition for community engagement, but it's not a sufficient condition. There's far more you have to do than simply be alive to the challenges of our context. And often, in my view, universities make a fundamental mistake between responsiveness and community engagement. And I want to suggest they're two different things. Third thesis, what status are we going to accord to community engagement? Do we want to build it as the third purpose, fundamental purpose of a university, or do we simply want to see it as one further key role of our universities? Now, I don't want to go into that issue, but let me just make the point. And I think it's a point that my previous speaker has also made with respect to a research incentives university, that the value and the quality of community engagement taken by a university strongly depends on the quality of a university's teaching and learning and research. That's to say, ultimately, any meaningful community engagement on the part of a university, any mutually beneficial partnerships we're going to have with communities, requires a university to be characterized by high-quality research, teaching, and learning. Let me put it in a different way. I regret that unless the quality of a university in terms of teaching and learning and research is of a certain nature, you cannot undertake any real quality community engagement. And I think sometimes we are very aspirational in this regard, but forgive me, I think communities deserve better than to be subject to outputs from universities that are of poor quality. That's being disdainful for communities. That's not respect. That's something else. So let's do what we are meant to do really well before we can talk about community engagement, because communities deserve a certain kind of quality in terms of teaching and learning and research. Thesis 4. We must also appreciate that community engagement is not a static concept. It has come historically over decades now, and there are different generations of community engagement. And then historically, community engagement has encompassed civic duty, community outreach of various kinds, whether it's called community service or community development. The two are very different things, and more recently, service learning. And then we must also distinguish between community engagement undertaken as volunteer activities by students and academics, which has been happening for many years, and community engagement as a matter of conscious institutional policy or practice, which is more recent. Okay? Now, if you look at historically community engagement, it's been approached in two different ways. Firstly, in some cases, teaching, learning, research, and community engagement are conceived of as essentially separate and distinct activities. Okay? And there's no connection between teaching and learning, research, and community engagement. That's the slide. Okay, many of the people involved in community engagement today may not recognize this. This is how community engagement actually starts. Here's teaching and learning, here's research, here's community engagement. There's no connections between them at all. And maybe often universities start like this. In other cases, teaching and learning, research, and community engagement are conceptualized as related and connected activities. In the one sense, they are intersecting activities. And where teaching and learning and community engagement overlap, that's where you get something called service learning. Where research and community engagement overlap, that's where you get something called service learning. This is relatively newer. And in a third conception, they are seen as cutting across activities. They run right through teaching and learning and research. Now, some people may argue this is the most engaged university, as compared to the one where they are seen as separate activities. And so service learning starts to represent learning, inquiry, discovery on the part of students and academics through mutually beneficial, respectful engagement with communities. Where civic duty and community outreach was just student volunteerism, staff volunteerism, service learning is embedded in teaching and learning. It's embedded on core knowledge production activities of the university. The first generation of community engagement didn't depend on teaching and learning really. It didn't depend on research. Service learning depends fundamentally on research and teaching and learning. And that's why you can't have good quality service learning unless you have good quality research and teaching and learning. And thirdly, and very important point, service learning becomes a curricular innovation within the universities by virtue of the fact that it becomes infused into the research we undertake and teaching and learning that we undertake. People go out as academics and students and they come back and learn from those activities. It's not charity. It's something that's mutually beneficial to both universities and students and academics and communities. In fact, sometimes people argue it's more beneficial to students and scholars than to communities. So thesis 5, insofar as there are different ways of approaching community engagement as separate activities, as intersecting activities, or cutting across, my own view is we should not prescribe to any university the way they should do community engagement. That ultimately there is room for these different approaches, and it all depends on how the university sees its role in a national system of higher education, what its mission is, and how it wants to live out its values. There's no right and wrong way of doing community engagement. Don't prescribe in an abstract way what might be good for a university in the United States doesn't mean it's a good thing for a university in South Africa. Okay? Let the university decide what kind of community engagement in relation to its values, its mission, and where it fits into the higher education system. Let's not have a tyranny of a single kind of approach dictated somewhere. Thesis 6, the Talwa Declaration, makes a very important point as far as community engagement is concerned. Universities carry a unique obligation to listen, understand, and contribute to social transformation and development. Higher education must extend itself for the good of society, the public good, rather than just private benefits. So of course this raises ethical issues and it raises the social values issues of community engagement. Who does this community engagement ultimately serve? And yes, to the extent that universities embrace this community engagement, it can help to translate our values into concrete action and deeds. It can become, as Amartya Sen writes, higher education as a promise of expanding the real freedoms that people employ. Thesis 7, many virtuous claims are made for community engagement. I've heard too many evangelists that are proselytizing community engagement. And forgive me, I get bored by them. The important thing about community engagement is we must interrogate the claims that are made for community engagement. Firstly, how do you forge an institutional consensus around community engagement? How do we define community engagement? There are also conceptual challenges relating to service learning. Service learning is not something we all agree about what it exactly constitutes. How do we develop curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, research methodologies related to community engagement? These are not simple issues, ladies and gentlemen. There are profoundly epistemological and ontological issues involved in these things. Let's not trivialize these issues. How do you translate this into academic program development, academic planning, institutional planning? Who is the community? How do we define this community? And so on. How do we recognize and reward academics for community engagement? At the moment, we love to reward our staff who produce research. How do you reward people who undertake community engagement at universities? And so on and so on. Thesis 8. If we want to build community engagement in our universities, don't imagine you can sit in the Vice-Chancellor's office and write out an administrative decree. From tomorrow, there shall be community engagement at my university. It doesn't work like that. There's got to be a process of continuous engagement, persuasion around community engagement. You've got to persuade the academics, who are hopefully serious academics, about the benefits of community engagement. The Vice-Chancellor might think it's a great thing. It doesn't mean it's going to happen at the university unless you persuade students and academics around this, around the value of community engagement. Thesis 9, like everything else, community engagement involves choices. And the really critical issues are, how are we going to formulate these available choices? How are we going to argue over them within the university? And through what just mechanisms will there be an opportunity to choose and to make decisions around community engagement? Thesis 10, yes, you need commitment, you need passion for community engagement, but we also need theorization and dispassionate reflection, as befitting a university. And it's very important that we develop a scholarly knowledge base through rigorous scholarship on community engagement, and that community engagement also becomes an area of scholarly and professional development within our universities. I think increasingly we are realizing the fact that you have a PhD doesn't mean you're going to be a good teacher, right? Forgive me. Lots of people who are outstanding researchers should not be in front of students. They should be in their labs. So in the same way we professionalize teaching and learning, we might have to professionalize community engagement also. It's not natural that will just happen because we are committed. Last thesis, community engagement has to inspire academics and students. We've got to effectively communicate, manage, implement community engagement if we want it to be successful. And ideas are good and important, but implementation is perhaps even more important. Good ideas not implemented don't make a difference in the world. And so, final point, the challenge is to map a deliberate, bold, and resolute, yet sober path with continuities, discontinuities as appropriate to the challenges and the context of our university. Thank you.
This was, I think, amazing, because you promised 10 and you delivered 11 theses. And by the way, I think many of you, the people here, liked your punches at the PhD teacher. But in general, I think we all appreciate very much the thoroughness of what you brought here to the table, also with many questions inherent, and once again, food for thought and also food for discussion. But on the teacher, particularly, I think you made a nice connection with the next speaker, with Eric Mazur, who is here actually going to speak mostly from a teaching perspective, because that's one of his hats, but he has so many hats. He's a chief physicist, Harvard Dean of Physics, of Applied Physics. He's also an accomplished entrepreneur in the sense that he has been able to indeed deal with the transmission of knowledge into entrepreneurship. And so I'm going very much to look forward to his talk about something which for me was in a way a surprise, because I knew of all these hats, but he's going to talk about diversity and gender issues. The floor is yours.
Before I start my talk, I want to make it interactive, so I need to be sure that you have one of these clickers. If you don't, raise your hand and somebody will, and that holds for the female part of the audience at the top too. You should have one of these clickers. Good. Okay. There's an ancient Chinese proverb that says, women hold up half the sky. I see that here you've put the women closer to the sky to help with this important task. Now, Women Hold Up Half the Sky was actually the title of a report by Goldman Sachs. One of the key theses of this report, which you can find on their global economic website of Goldman Sachs, is that female education is the key to long-term economic growth. They show, for example, that countries that have a greater investment in female education, that investment is paired with a raise in gross domestic product, a significant increase. Also, they show that narrowing the gender gap in employment could push the increase in income per capita up 14% by 2020 and 20% by 2030 above the baseline. Okay, so now that I hope that everybody has a clicker, I want to briefly explain how they work, because as I said, I'm going to make this interactive and I'm going to poll you on a couple of issues. When I ask a question, there are going to be multiple choice questions. You simply push a button, 1, 2, 3, and so on. If I could have the clicker display for a moment, I can show you what I can see. There we go. As you press on the buttons, this little distribution changes. Go ahead. I see a lot of people like button number 1, but you can press any button you want. And as you change your vote, it's instantly reflected on that distribution until I hit this stop button here, which will no longer permit you to vote. Let's start by seeing if we have indeed an equal number of clickers closer to the sky and further away from the sky. So if you're female, press 1. If you're male, press 2. I just want to have an idea of the distribution here. Okay, good. So female 1, male 2. Okay. So let's now have a quick look at where people are from here. If you're from the kingdom, press 1. If you're from another Middle East country, press 2. If you're from yet further away, press 3. So you see here that we have an overwhelming participation from the kingdom and about 20% of the people from outside. Okay, good. We'll use it in a more meaningful way in just a second. Anyway, when I read that report from Goldman Sachs, I was reminded about some data that I had collected in my own class that disturbed me very much. I found that in my own physics class, and I have to tell you, I teach undergraduates at Harvard who are not going to go on in physics. These are mostly engineering students, pre-medical students, mostly biology, life sciences, who have to take physics in order to meet their concentration requirements. And at the end of the semester, these are actually data that are not from Harvard, they're from the University of Minnesota. We find that on a test that tests understanding of some basic physics concepts, men outscore women. I want to talk briefly about this gap between the performance of men and women at this university in Minnesota, but as you can see, we have a similar gap of about 10% in 2 different classes at Harvard. The one on the left of the middle, is one class, a higher level physics class, and the one to the right of the middle is a lower level physics class, both taught by me, and at Worcester Polytechnic Institution. So I see that at 3 very different institutions in the US, a large state school, the University of Minnesota, 2 classes in a first-tier private institution, Harvard, and then Worcester Polytechnic representing a smaller liberal arts type college, we have a significant gap, a statistically significant gap in the performance of male and female students. And the question I want to address here is why. So why don't we just see what people think here, just hypothesize here. Is it because men tend to think more logically, as some people have suggested sometime? Is it just a cultural thing and the gap is not universal? Differences in natural ability or something else? So please, there's no 8, by the way. Okay. I'm going to, in the future, keep the vote hidden so that I'll only display it when everybody has voted. Okay. A very broad distribution of answers here. So I want to talk briefly about this problem that we have, and secondly, about what we could do about it. And it turns out that the interactive teaching approach that I described here last year does indeed help address this inequality, and lastly, show you some data. So first of all, is it cultural? Well, I have had the opportunity during sabbaticals to spend time at a number of different institutions. If we take all of the gaps in the US and put them together, we get to about 10%. I spent 1 year sabbatical in Belgium. I won't disclose which university. The dean asked me not to present those data, but I mean, not disclose which university it was. But in Belgium, the gap was twice as large. And then in Taiwan, where I had another sabbatical a few years later, the gap was no longer statistically significant. The big differences in these different institutions, but here I have to hypothesize because I haven't been able to do sufficient research, is that in Belgium, on the physics faculty at the university where I was, which is quite a distinguished university in science, there were no female faculty. It was an all-male faculty. In the US, there tends to be about 3/4 male faculty in physics department, 1/4 female. In Taiwan, at the institution where I carried out this test, there was complete gender balance. So at least there were role models of professional physicists in Taiwan, which were absent in Belgium. Now, these data are actually echoed by a study that was done by the OECD in 2011 based on data obtained with PISA. The study is called How Do Girls Compare to Boys in Science? And I'm going to show you in this graph the performance, the science performance, not just physics, but all of science, of 15-year-old children for different countries. On the vertical, I put the average score, so the higher the data point, the better that country does in science. On the horizontal is the gender gap. Let's start by drawing a line at 0. Any data points to the left shows that boys are doing better than girls. Any point to the right shows that girls are doing better than boys. Here's the data point for the US, mirroring the data that I just showed you, with boys outscoring girls. These are all other Northwestern European and American countries. And as you can see, there's a preponderance of points to the left. There's no data point for Saudi Arabia, but if we look at the greatest outlier on the right, meaning female students do better than male students, we find a data point for Jordan, which is right there, with female student outscoring by about 9% the boys. Here are other Southeastern European and Middle Eastern countries, all tending to lie on the right side of 0. And if you look at the Asian data points, they are actually much more clustered near 0. So after you see this, why not vote again? I think we can eliminate at least a few of those choices. So go ahead. What is the cause of the gap that I showed? 1, men tend to think more logically. 2, it's just a cultural thing. Okay. Let's show you the distribution. Oops, where did my mouse go? Okay, there we go. It's just a cultural thing. That I think that arguing for 1 or for 3 would be very difficult in light of the data that I have just shown. So if you still voted 1 and 3, you better look at those data again in your own time. Okay, so what about let's go back to the US. What about the effect of pre-college education? If I look at a test that tests understanding of physics of students who come to my class, some of them have never had any physics before. Some have had just an ordinary high school physics course, and others have had an advanced placement course, which is like a college level course in high school. You can see that for the women, the performance on this test at the beginning of the term, so that's before I teach them, tracks their education, their pre-college education, but not as much as you would expect. What about the men? Well, they outscore the women, but the gap sort of persists. It doesn't erase that gap. And even more disturbing is that the women tend to be underrepresented. So while we have more or less gender equity between the students who have never had any high school physics or high school physics, there are far fewer women who take the advanced placement course in the US of the students who come to Harvard than the male students. So I want you to ponder this question for a moment. What would be a possible explanation of the differences in this gender gap? Is it a social reinforcement of gender stereotypes? Is it differences in the approach to education? Or maybe it's just statistical fluctuations and there's not really a problem at all. Or could it be due to differences in gender segregation in education? So think about this for 10 seconds, make your choice. Five. So please get your votes in. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so what I want you to do now, because this is how I teach my classes, is I want you to turn to your neighbor, find a neighbor who made a different choice, and see if you can convince that you made the right choice. So go ahead, talk to each other. I'm going to give you 2 minutes.
So what number
Okay, 30 seconds. I would like you to make up your mind. If you've not changed your mind, please vote for exactly the same choice you voted first. But if you have changed your mind, then reflect that, please, in the second round. The reason I have you talk to each other is because I don't want to impose my views, and I want to make you an active participant here in this talk, and I want you to think on your own, which is what I want my students to do too. So please vote again. This will be the last vote we do today, because my time is going to be running out. Also, after you voted, I don't want to forget this today. We used them yesterday in the rector's workshop and actually lost quite a few because people thought they could take them home. They're not a gift. So please, 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 leave them behind on the seat so that I don't get into trouble with the company that makes these available. Okay, so let's see what we have right now. And let's actually also see if people change their vote. So I think 1 is the most popular one. This was before discussion and after discussion. Before in blue, after in red. So people seem to have shifted more towards that choice number 1. I can assure you that it's not statistical fluctuations. These data are very statistically significant. Also, I can tell you that it's not due to differences in gender segregation. In the US, there are quite a few institutions that have gender segregated education, and the data are the same as they are in non-segregated coeducational institutions. So it's probably somewhere between 1 and 2. Okay, so what can we do? Well, there's lots of literature that shows that increasing collaboration and interactivity and communication actually helps mitigate that gap. And let me remind you of what I presented last year here. which is the interactive approach to teaching that I use, which is very similar to what we just did a moment ago. I don't teach by telling, I teach by questioning, which is something that the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates already told us to do 21 centuries ago. And here we are, still mostly telling. So I ask questions. I ask students to think about it, just like you thought about your question just a moment ago. I poll them. I have them talk to each other. I poll them again, just as we did. We wrap up, and we repeat this cycle until class time is up. That's how I teach my classes. Some students actually accuse me of not teaching them. They have to learn it all on their own. But that's okay, because that's the only way you can learn. So it's during that discussion that the actual learning takes place. Let me show you a very brief video clip of how this works in practice. I guess the video is not playing. Well, we don't need the video because you just demonstrated it yourself. You would just see me teaching my own class. So we'll just skip. We're actually close to running out of time anyway. So I will show you how I was able to compare 3 different pedagogies in my class. One was traditional lectures, talking, like I'm doing now. The other one was interactive lectures, having students talk to each other. And the third one was not only make the in-class component interactive, but everything else too, homework, discussion sessions, you name it. So we'll label those T for traditional, IE for interactive engagement, and IE plus for interactive engagement plus. Here are the performances of the women in the 3 different categories. They're not different. This is on the pre-test, on the first day of class. They've not been exposed to any of this, so no wonder that they're no different. The little triangle on the left shows the average of those 3. Here are the men. Some variation, but not very much, and you can see that gap. The post-test, you can see that the more interactive, the more the women gain, the higher they score above the original score, which is shown by that little triangle on the far left. The men also gain more, so it doesn't just benefit the women, it benefits everyone.
Eric, 1 minute left, please.
Yep, but the gap is essentially gone. It's no longer statistically significant. Another thing is that you can see who are the low-gain students. If you plot all of the women in the class and all of the men, in the traditional class, you see that there are more underperforming women than there are men. After changing to an interactive format, that gender balance has been restored. So, in conclusion, what I want you to keep in mind is that the gap comes from the culture and the background, and that whatever has caused that gap, it can be corrected even if you wait all the way to higher education by bringing the interaction back. So I hope I've made it clear that education is key to gender equality. There's simply no better investment in terms of economic growth and progress. Of course, this education has to be followed by employment opportunities, which is something I have not discussed. Maybe we can talk about that later. Finally, what I said applies not only to gender, but also to diversity. If you look at minorities and the performance of minorities, I have no time to show you the data. You have to take my word for it, or look on my website. But you'll find that similar arguments hold there. And lastly, what made my institution such an amazing institution is something that started about 100 years ago with President Eliot, who made a push for diversity. Currently, at Harvard, 20% of students are foreign nationals, representing 80 different countries in an essentially gender-balanced class. It's this wonderful diversity, I think, that makes it possible to have this cross-pollination of different cultures and different ideas, and that make it such an exciting place to be. Please leave your clicker behind, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Eric, for the way in which you bring Socrates alive again, which cannot be done, I think, enough in the sense of making us aware that it's not about teaching, but it's about learning of students, and that in that respect, you should organize yourself as a institution interested in learning by being interactive and by particularly questioning, raising curiosity. Ladies and gentlemen, so this was the first part of our session, and so we have now this exciting part that it's up to you how we are going to have the discussion. We will take in questions, and there are a couple of rules for the questions. That is, first of all, we like you very much to be brief in terms of the questions. We also like the speakers to be brief in their answers, so that we have ample opportunity for everyone to indeed raise points. The second is, please state your name and affiliation, and since this is a big audience, also wave please at us, so that we know where you are, because that's not so easily always to be seen. And so there are already a couple of people who are showing their hands, but we would like very much to start at, how did you call that, Eric? That is the half of the population which holds up the sky. So, and maybe we take 3 questions at a time. Can I ask upstairs, are there microphones upstairs? Yes, and there was a lady standing there. Please go ahead. Yes, hello, we can hear you.
My name is Nofal Khlewi, and I'm from King Saud University. I'm studying my PhD in higher education. My question is, can we say that higher education enters a new phase where social responsibility now is considered as an independent rule for the university? This is my first question. My second question, what's the difference between social responsibility for university and corporate social responsibility? Because most of the research that I found are about corporate more than social responsibility as a rule of the university. Is it clear?
Yes, if I can repeat it, first question is social responsibility part of modernizing higher education? And the second is social responsibility, does that have also a strong component with respect to cultural sensitivity? Is that correct?
Is corporate social responsibility and social
Yes.
The same thing. Yeah.
I think maybe you can reply, Salim, directly, because you have understood the question and I may not have heard it as well as you have. Please go ahead.
No, I was just clarifying that I think the question was, is social responsibility and corporate social responsibility one and the same thing?
Please go ahead. What is your
I don't
view?
have the answer to that.
There is here غلام who has reflected on this.
They're not necessarily the same, because corporate social responsibility refers to the corporate body, to the, to the firm, to whatever it is. And I wouldn't like to think of universities as being a corporate body as such. It's a higher education institution, and its mission is teaching, research, and engagement with the community. And the whole idea is to embed the idea of social responsibility in those particular functions. Corporate social responsibility, I think, is slightly different. But that doesn't mean that in corporate organizations they don't have a duty towards social responsibility. But I don't think it's one and the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Maybe another question from the sky. Yes, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Nira Al-Qasim, student in KSU University, Human Resource Management. My question is, what do you think the student's role, or is it essential for the student to be to enforce social responsibility in my university, my own university? Thank you.
It's very difficult to hear that.
Was it critical for the students to pass social?
Ian, did you catch the question?
It wasn't clear. I think the question was whether it was critical for students, all students, to actually pass a unit in social responsibility, was it?
My question is, is they have essential role, and if they do, how? The students.
The role of students in, maybe Ian, you can address that.
It's an interesting one. I mean, I think that I think if you actually look at you say what are universities? Well, universities are students of the institution. So I think if a university is going to say it's an institution that sees social responsibility as being important, then I think it's the people within it who actually are what actually make that real. So I think the answer is perhaps not all of them, and never in any community, not all people will do any one thing. But I think that if an institution is going to have a real social responsibilities core, then that has to be. You actually see that in the people within the organisation as well.
Okay. Yeah. Salim.
I might answer that in a certain way. I do know there are academics who think that the ideal university would be one without students, but we're not going to adopt that position. It also depends on the conception of a university. Today, unfortunately, there are many universities who seem to think that students are customers and clients. Well, if you see students as customers and clients, then there's not much sense of responsibility on the part of students. But if you hold on to the idea that a university is a place that produces knowledge and wants to advance human understanding and learning, well, then as we've heard from the last speaker, that learning can only take place if someone embraces that learning. And so students, of course, have huge social responsibilities. They have a social responsibility to a partnership between academics and students around advancing knowledge, around discovery, and so on. And I also like to think that when students come to universities, they are not there simply to absorb and imbibe knowledge, they're also there to help us produce knowledge. So none of those things can happen without a key responsibility accruing on the part of students. You are not just passive vessels there to be filled by someone. You are active learners who must contribute to the project of a university.
One third question from above, and then we go down. We have 20 minutes still left, so we have ample time to discuss. Whom can I invite?
Hello, this is Suzanne Bardis from Al-Qura University. You talked about the researcher who's not a teacher and the teacher who's not a researcher. Of course, the ideal situation is for someone to be a teacher and a researcher, but a lot of people would find themselves one of the first two. So how would those people serve their community better? How, like, what would they do to, you know, I don't know, improve the situation? If you're a researcher and you're not a teacher, then is that enough? If you're a teacher and not a researcher, again, is that enough? Or should you do more?
Right, so I think there are two people who have thought about this a lot. First of all, the person who gave the punch, Salim, you were the puncher, but okay, Eric, I think, has also thought about this a lot.
Especially since I do both.
Yes, yeah.
And, you know, I really don't see a huge difference between those two responsibilities that I carry. I have a large research group, about 40 people, doing work in photonics, and as I just told you, I teach as well. Doing research is part of education too, because around me are graduate students who are carrying out the research and who are not only advancing the knowledge, but they're learning how to become scientists too. And in order to disseminate those results that are obtained in my laboratory, you have to be good at communicating the results. So the skills that come in teaching are important in research, and vice versa too. I always treat my classroom as an extension to my laboratory. I will never miss an opportunity to actually research, to take data and research in my classroom how to teach more effectively and better. So I really see those two activities as being completely linked. I don't separate them.
Ian, you also want to talk on this topic?
Could I just reinforce that? I think it's actually, if I look at myself, my own background, so I've been a researcher and a teacher and more recently an administrator, But my most productive times as a researcher were when I was actively teaching as well. So I think they actually, my view is that rather than these things competing with each other, they actually reinforce each other. And if I can take one step further, the things that we've been talking about around community engagement, and I think Salim said it, but it was also in my own theme, I think if an institution is going to engage with its community, it has to be good at teaching and research. That's why it engages. That's why the community wants it to engage with it, because it has that intellectual capacity. So I think it's critically important for that as well.
Right. So would you say this is a matter of how you organize your university? Because Salim, you really gave the punch in the sense, and this is recognized quite often, that there was too much of a dominance of research in the research universities above the teaching.
I was just trying to clarify that ideally I agree with the two colleagues. Ideally, the ideal academic is someone who takes research seriously, someone who takes teaching seriously, and someone who takes community engagement seriously. That's the ideal. Let's be honest about that.
Yeah.
Myself as a Vice Chancellor, I'm quite happy to allocate to the academic departments the responsibility to ensure that collectively they undertake research, teaching and learning, and community engagement. How specifically they organize that, they have the autonomy to decide on that. But I do know that even at the most research-intensive universities, not everyone necessarily undertakes the scholarship of discovery, i.e. new knowledge production. There are people who are outstanding teachers. Let's recognize them for their teaching, as long as they are involved in the scholarship of integration or synthesis, i.e. reading journals, reading new books, making that part of dissemination. But even the most research-intensive universities, I would like to think not everyone is producing new knowledge in the form of books and so on. Okay. And then, in that context, to answer more directly what I was hearing, I'm very skeptical whether I will ever employ as an academic at my university, which is also a research and postgraduate university, someone who is only good in community engagement.
Yeah.
I can see myself voting for someone who's an outstanding teacher, but maybe doesn't do a lot of new knowledge production. I can see myself voting to employ someone who's an outstanding researcher, whose teaching may not be the greatest, and therefore we're not going to put them in front of the first-year class. But I can't see myself employing someone who's just good in community engagement, because that community engagement must be predicated on research and teaching and learning.
Thank you very much. And we go to the speaker there.
Yes, please. Thank you very much. It's an honor for all of us to attend this very informative papers. And my question is, the first speaker, he gave an insight about one of the most important aspects of social responsibility. It is about environmental awareness, adopting recycling programs, adopting, shifting to renewable energy, adopting. How can we do that if still the society is behind or the city is behind in adopting these recycling program papers and how? So who will start it? I mean, is it the department that teach courses in environmental engineering, or it is the social studies students, or how they start in the West? When I were there in University of Toronto in Canada in the last century, between 1997 and 1991, and every secretary office and every printing room, there's a box for recycling paper, box for, so they adopted at the same time, and the city was adopting the recycling programs. But now, since the city is still behind, just they assigned, I think, 254 million Saudi riyal for the sanitary landfill, 18 sanitary landfills programs or something. They assigned it recently, Ministry of Mora. But the recycling programs still behind, yani.
I understand the question.
Not only papers, bottles, everything. Thank you.
So the question is really, how do you promote attention for the environment, and what is the role of the university? How can they exercise that?
If I understood you rightly, you're talking about the disparity between trying to promote social responsibility within an institution located in a community, which is not really very strong in promoting social. Was that the question?
Yes, and how do you promote more conscientiousness with respect to environment? What is the role of a university in this respect?
Well,
I
think the whole idea of what we call the greening the campus is precisely